Good morning. It's good to be here. Good to see everybody. I went too far. Let me pull up my... We're in Luke 13, looking at questions Jesus asked. And... I was just making sure we didn't leave off in... Well, there's two related questions. I try to avoid that whenever possible, so that each lesson stands by itself. But we left off our next question, again, as I often say, unique question, because some of these have been covered in Matthew or Mark. But the next unique question we come to is in Luke 13. Jesus is... He does some teaching on repentance. And of course, that's the section we looked at last week. The idea that some of these folks had that the people that Pilate mingled their blood with the sacrifice, or the people upon whom the Tower of Siloam fell and killed them. He asked the question: do you think that they were somehow sinners above all men, and that this happened to them because they were just such grievous sinners? Job's friends had the same idea with Job. They came, and Brother Curtis Cates taught us the book of Job in preaching school, and he was kind of, it seems like whether it's a college or preaching school, you got a teacher or teachers that will teach a certain book of the Bible or a certain topical study, and they're kind of famous for that, and that was Brother Cates with the book of Job. The joke used to be that he could tell you what Job had for breakfast. He knew Job and the book so well. And the other joke that the students used to make was that not even Job himself could pass the Job final that Brother Cates gave. But he always, he would grade on a kind of a curve, so it made it at least doable, unless you were like our class and you had that one guy that he was just determined, and he would throw off the curve quite often for our class. But even he needed some help on the Job final. I remember that very well. But Jesus is he's making a point that is the same point that's made in the book of Job. Just because somebody suffers doesn't mean that there's some kind of big-time sinner and God is lashing out at them for that. Brother Cates used to say in that class, I remember very well him talking about Job's friends coming, and they sat with him and they didn't say a word for 7 days. And it was when they opened their mouths that they became bad friends, if you want to use that term. They were doing well until they started speaking. And when they started speaking, then they start this, Job, you need to repent. What have you done? You must have done something really bad. God wouldn't be doing this to you if you hadn't done something really bad. And of course, even Job himself mistook, thinking that this was God doing this. It was really Satan. But the idea that because somebody suffers, because they go through something bad, they must be sinning. And Jesus says, if you don't repent of that type of thinking, you'll all likewise perish. We do sometimes suffer because of sin. Sometimes we suffer because of our own bad choices. Sometimes we suffer because of other people's bad choices. You think about all the innocent people that have died at the hands of drunk drivers. Abortion has been a hot topic in the news with the election cycle and all that. How many innocent children, the most innocent of people, have died because of a sinful choice to abort that child, to take that child's life. And, we sometimes benefit from other people's choices or their intelligence. I mean, here we sit, or in my case stand, in a building that is climate controlled, and that's because of the advances of technology through the years. And so sometimes we benefit from other people's choices, other generations even, but sometimes we suffer because of other people's choices. Sometimes we suffer even because of another generation's choices. You have some countries where war has been going on for more than a generation, and you have children and innocents that are suffering because of an entirely previous generation. But it's not necessarily always because someone has sinned. And really the flip side of that's true as well. Just because somebody is doing well, they're healthy, they're wealthy, things are going great, man, they must be doing something right. That's how we sometimes think. That's not necessarily the case either. So that's Jesus' point there in those first 5 verses. And he uses that to lead into the fruitless fig tree. And he leads into that parable about this man. He's got the tree planted in his vineyard. I was trying to remember what it was that I wanted to mention following up on the questions from last week. He planted this fig tree, and I touched on it briefly last week, but I just want to make the point. The tree was planted in his vineyard. He came and sought fruit thereon, found none. He says unto the vine dresser, or the dresser of the vineyard, King James says, behold, these 3 years I come seeking fruit on this fig tree and find none. Cut it down. Why cumbereth it the ground? We might paraphrase and say, why is this thing just taking up space? It's not bringing forth fruit. If you had a fruit tree that's not bringing forth fruit, and that's what you're needing it for and expecting it to do, and in this context, this would be somehow tied to his livelihood probably, or at least feeding his family. He said, what's the point? It's just taking up space. And he answering, the vine dresser, said unto him, Lord, let it alone this year, till I shall dig about it and dung it. I'm going to fertilize it, till up the soil some, see if we can't get it to bear fruit. And then verse 9 says, and if it bear fruit, well, and if not, then after that thou shalt cut it down. And so kind of a one last chance. Picture here of the Jewish nation, an unfruitful tree. Not every single Jewish individual, some of them believed on Jesus, some of them listened to Jesus, sent from heaven to teach the gospel, to teach people how to live their lives pleasing in God's sight. Some people did, but for the most part, the nation was rejecting him. And so this is kind of last chance. You need to accept the Christ. Of course, judgment was coming, and that picture of the uprooting of the tree is seen for the Jewish nation in AD 70 when the Romans came and just utterly destroyed the city of Jerusalem. This next section is where our next question is. Jesus heals on the Sabbath is the heading I have in my Bible. He's teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. I preached on this, I don't know, it's probably been a year or so ago, but a very interesting passage. And behold, there was a woman which had a spirit of infirmity 18 years, and was bowed together and could in no wise lift up herself. It seems she's got something that's just kind of bent her over. I think about this, and it reminds me of when I had, back in 2003, very end of 2003, I ruptured a disc in my back, my lower back, and I'd had some trouble before that, but usually I could go to the chiropractor and get adjusted, and it would kind of straighten out, and sometimes it would hurt more, sometimes less, but there were warning signs. But I remember it was, we lived in a rental house in Chattanooga. We had just moved to Chattanooga to work with the Greens Lake Road congregation as an associate minister, and I got out that Saturday afternoon raking leaves. We had these big oak trees in that yard, and man, they would just drop ridiculous amounts of leaves in the fall. So I was out there raking leaves, raking, and a chiropractor had told me, this was later, I didn't know it that day, but there are things that you do, rotation, that if you have disc problem, it's going to aggravate it, and but it did. He said he was telling me, if you're sweeping and you do that rotation, swap sides every now and then, so you don't just. But I didn't know that, and so I raked, and I woke up the next morning. I couldn't even get out of the bed. I had ruptured a disc, and we still laugh about that because Reagan was pregnant with Joshua, and was just she was, as the King James would say, great with child. And it was just kind of any moment now. The preacher he was on a mission trip in the Ukraine and was still gone for another 2 or 3 weeks. And so I was preaching every Sunday, but we had one of the deacons there, and he had understanding how close she was to giving birth. We had an agreement. He had a sermon kind of in his back pocket ready so that should it happen on a Sunday morning, he'd be ready to go. So here I am. I can't get out of bed. I call him up. And I said, Les, I need you. And he said, oh, we're all right. We're going to have a baby. She in labor? And I said, no, I can't get out of bed. I've done something to my back. And he said, oh, no. So he preached for me that morning, and it took a while because we didn't have, I had not found a secular job yet at that point other than some part-time work, and didn't have insurance. So it took a while to get where I could go and get an MRI and all that. But as a result of that, I had the typical, the sciatic shooting down your leg and all that. But it was the strangest thing. Because of that, when I did finally get, like that afternoon, I got out on all fours crawling around the house because I just couldn't stand up. And somebody told me later, sometimes that'll kind of loosen your back up a little bit or whatever. And so I got to where I could finally stand up. And I got to where I could just live with it, even though it was very uncomfortable, painful. But the strangest thing was, I'd be bent over like just, kind of like what you read about here, just bowed together. And it'd get me down to about right here. And sometimes I didn't even realize it. And Reagan would say, are you hurting? I say, yeah, I'm always hurting. And she'd say, well, you're like bent over double almost. And so I'd try to straighten up, and I could, really feel that. And I'd get straightened up, and before I know it, I'd start bending over. And one of my friends, before I was able to get the surgery that fixed that, a laminectomy they call it, one of my friends got married, and he asked me to be a groomsman in the wedding. And so here I am standing up there with the wedding party, and we're all kind of facing this way, and I'd start over, and I'd realize it. I'd try to straighten up, and I'd be like, I'm going to stay straight because I look ridiculous. And next thing you know, you just didn't even know it. But here's a lady that, I thought it was bad being like that for 7 or 8 months. She's been that way for 18 years. Couldn't lift herself up, couldn't straighten herself up, we might say. And when Jesus saw her, he called her to him and said unto her, Woman, thou art loosed from thine infirmity. So here's Jesus. He's in the synagogue. He's teaching in the synagogue. But there's something else significant there in verse 10. What is it? It's on the Sabbath. And they are constantly criticizing Jesus when he does something good on the Sabbath. And they falsely accuse him time and time again of working on the Sabbath, which is, realizing who Jesus truly is, God in the flesh. Is anything work for him? But he never violated the Sabbath, even as a human being walking this earth. And that's, again, he's going to make that point right here in this text. So he calls her to him. And so it seems that preacher there at Greens Lake Road, Brother Jim Lewis, who is still there serving as an elder now, but he kind of preaches part-time. He became the associate preacher when Papa, Roger, my father-in-law, came to preach there a few years ago. And so Jim still serves as one of the elders, but he told me one time, he said something. He said, sometimes I think Jesus healed on the Sabbath just to, not trying to pick a fight, mind you, but to make a point to them. Because they had these ideas, not just about the Sabbath. We've already seen it in Matthew chapter 15, paralleled in Mark 7, where they have this tradition about washing of hands, and it's not about germs, it's about pomp and circumstance and ceremony. And they say, if you don't do that, you're not clean. And they criticize Jesus and his disciples, and of course, he's having none of it. He says, you have elevated your tradition above the Word of God. And so they have these ideas, and it does seem sometimes, in fact, it's hard to argue here that he's not doing this very intentionally to make a point to some of them that don't understand the whole point of the Sabbath law, the spirit of the law, we might say, and that mistakenly think that doing something good for someone to help someone is somehow working on the Sabbath. Can you imagine, the parable of the Good Samaritan? Here, what if you come upon somebody who that had happened to them, and you come upon them on the Sabbath? Of course, they had rules about the Sabbath, even to the point of saying you couldn't travel more than, I forget what the tradition said, something like 1/8 of a mile something like that. And if you traveled more than that, you had worked on the Sabbath and you had broken the law and were, standing under condemnation unless you make that right. And it was such an ingrained tradition. In fact, I had read that at some point and I didn't catch that it was a Jewish tradition. And on the little television program we did up there, we did a live Q&A, 1-hour program. There were like 12 congregations that participated in that. And when Brother Jim's rotation came around, the preacher there at Greens Lake Road, he was always teaching a class on Tuesday nights when the program aired at the Gateway Church up in Benton, Tennessee. So I was always filling in for Jim. And here I am on there one time, and I'm talking, it was something to do with the Sabbath, and I mentioned that, you were not allowed to travel more than 1/8 of a mile on the Sabbath, or whatever that number was. And I mentioned it, and somebody, I can't remember if somebody called in and said something, or if one of the preachers on the program said, are you sure about that? Maybe just check that, because I don't think that's in the law anywhere. And I did some more research and said, oops, that was one of those traditions. It was one of the traditions that they bound. And so to them, they would say, yeah, you sinned if you went more than that whatever distance. But that's not what the law said. And so I corrected that, but I felt kind of foolish. But, we're all always learning, and sometimes it's easy to make a mistake like that. But can you imagine coming upon someone, they've been injured, they need help, such as in that instance of the Good Samaritan, and here you are, a Jewish person, and you say, well, I would help you. You obviously need some help, somebody to try to dress up those wounds a little bit and put you on their beast and take you to the inn to get you some medical care, some rest. But the reality is this is Sabbath, and I'm sorry. But I tell you what, at sundown, Sabbath will be over, and I'll come check on you. And do you really think is that what God meant? And I'm not appealing to emotion here as authority, not just, well, is that, sometimes we try to say, well, does God really want ... But looking at the law as it was given, is that what God said? He said you don't work in the sense of you're not going to go to your job, you're not going to go, it's a day to reflect, to rest, to remember, to think about God. It was a day of worship for them. And if you see somebody in need, you need to help them. And that's what Jesus sees here. He sees somebody in need. So he calls her to him. And he says, you're loose from your infirmity. He laid his hands on her, verse 13 says, and immediately she was made straight and glorified God. And so can you imagine this? I mean, just picture what probably would have been a fairly packed house. It's synagogue, and it's Saturday, it's the Sabbath. So every good Jewish person is there. And so Jesus, he's teaching, and in the midst of that, he calls this lady up there. We're not told what he was teaching on at that time. Could have been teaching about the Sabbath. Could have been teaching about helping others, doing good. I don't know. But he calls this lady up there. And he lays his hands on her and he says, you're loose from your infirmity. And I mean, immediately, she's just from doubled over. She can't, here she is, and she's just, kind of staring at the floor and probably just trying to look up, even to make eye contact or attempt to make eye contact with Jesus. And then all of a sudden, she's straightened up. And she's giving glory to God. The natural reaction, you would think, right? And so everybody's seeing this. And boy, it fires up the ruler of the synagogue. It makes you wonder if he's just sitting there listening as Jesus is teaching. A lot of these Jewish religious leaders didn't care for Jesus because he was no respecter of persons. He didn't, go, the ruler of the synagogue, I'm going to, play up to him or whatever. And so it makes you wonder sort of if he's not sitting there, listening to Jesus teaching sort of with his arms crossed and maybe a scowl on his face, and he's just listening, and he takes it as long as he can. Jesus calls this lady up there, and here it is on the Sabbath, and next thing you know, he's healed her, and here it is the Sabbath day, and she's starting to glorify God, and buddy, you can almost just see him, and he stands up, and he said, I'm not going to take this anymore. The ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation because that Jesus had healed on the Sabbath day. And I don't know, again, I preached on this not terribly long ago, so it's still a little bit fresh on my mind because I really, really enjoy it. I'd never preached on this passage, never studied it that in depth until I preached it. But it makes you wonder, had he seen Jesus dealing with some of these other religious leaders and how they couldn't answer him? They couldn't get anywhere with Jesus because, he's Jesus. He's the master teacher. You try to pull one over on him, you try to outsmart him, you're going to lose every time. And so, here's Jesus and this lady. Maybe, I don't know where the ruler of the synagogue will be. Maybe he's over here, and he stands up, but he's not going to address Jesus. He's going to turn to the crowd, and he's going to address them. Maybe that's just what he chose to do. Maybe it's because of some of the other people's interaction with Jesus and their inability to outsmart him, outwit him. But be that as it may, he turns to the crowd, and he says to the people, there are 6 days in which men ought to work. In them, therefore, come and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day. Well, here she is. She's there. She's in need. Jesus healed her. And he turns to the crowd and says, you should come some other day if you want to be healed. And he's, in a backhanded way, aiming that at her. Of course, obviously at Jesus as well. Hey, y'all should know this. There are 6 days in which men ought to work. You come on one of those days. Was he going to heal her? He couldn't heal her. And furthermore, was she at the back going, can I be healed today? Can I be healed? Or did Jesus call her? So it kind of seems like this guy's a little bit chicken. I don't know. Again, there's not really enough there to say for sure. It's almost like he's too scared to address Jesus for whatever reason. And so he addresses the crowd and makes this swipe at the lady who didn't say, hey, please heal me. She was called up there by Jesus. So you got a beef. You got a beef with Jesus, not with her. Yes, sir.
If the ruler of the synagogue had been afflicted for 18 years and he was in the presence of Jesus, and Jesus called him up to himself, that ruler of the synagogue wouldn't say, hold off, this is the Sabbath. He would have accepted what Jesus was offering.
That's right. And it's easy to say when it's somebody else's infirmity, right? Hey, y'all need to come on a different day. I heard a story of this guy. He went to a dentist office, and he said, look, got a bad situation here, need a tooth pulled, and we don't have a lot of money, don't have a lot of time, so just don't have time for any like shots for Novocaine or anything like that. Let's just pull this tooth and get it done quickly. And the dentist says, well, okay, I do have an opening. I can take you right now. And he said, I tell you what, a lot of people are scared of the dentist. I wish all my patients were as brave as you are. I said, what tooth is it? He said, go ahead and show him, honey. It's easy when it's somebody else, right? To say, I think it was Leroy Dedman that we used to laugh. Sometimes somebody talk about somebody's having surgery. They're having a minor surgery. And somebody kind of laughed and said, what's the difference in a minor surgery and a major surgery? And Leroy said, major's when it's on you. Minor was when it's on somebody else. But this leader of the ruler of the synagogue, he's upset and says, 6 days in which men ought to work. Come on one of those and be healed. As Robert pointed out, that's easy to say when you're not the one who's been suffering for 18 years. And here's the point that Jesus is going to make in all this. He should have had compassion. He should have been like her and glorifying God. Can you imagine if somebody is, even in a modern day context, What if somebody they get better and they've been sick for a long time? Are we happy about that? Are we upset about that? I can't imagine us being upset, but we ought to be overjoyed, especially somebody suffering that long, 18 years. So the Lord answered him and said, and I mean, Jesus, this is one of those occasions where I picture Jesus probably, again, I can't say for sure because we don't have, we can't hear the voice here. We don't hear the inflection, but you can almost picture Jesus snapping at this ruler of the synagogue because Jesus loved people and he loved this sweet soul that, bless her heart, as we say in the South, she has been tormented, afflicted for 18 years, and now she's healed. And here is this guy with the gall, the audacity to get up and say something critical, not of Jesus who did this and called her forward, but of her. And to call her out like that. Jesus says, "Thou hypocrite." And I was going to look. Yeah, New King James has it as an exclamation. ESV says, "You hypocrites," but again, an exclamation. NASB, no exclamation there, but it seems like he is kind of snapping. Hypocrite. And the "thou" is italicized. It's supplied by the translators for clarity. But it's very obvious when it says the Lord answered him. He's addressing the ruler of the synagogue. And he says, "You hypocrite. Doth not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or his donkey from the stall?" And, to say as the English Standard Version? Yeah, hypocrites, plural. That certainly is applicable because what the plural here would be these religious leaders that would bind things that God's law has not bound. And so he says, "You hypocrite or hypocrites, does not each one of you on the Sabbath loose his ox or donkey from the stall and lead him away to watering?" I'll tell you what, it's a lot more work than what Jesus did in healing this woman. "And ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham," she's a Jewish lady, she's in a covenant relationship with God. "Ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan hath bound, lo, these 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day?" The New King James words that, "So ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound," think of it, "for 18 years be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath." I was looking to see, New American Standard Bible says for 18 long years. But you get the idea. He's kind of emphasizing that. She's a child of God. And if you are okay with loosing your donkey, loosing an ox, taking him out of the stall, to water him, even to feed him, but you're not okay with a woman being healed who is a child of God, a soul who's been afflicted for 18 long years, we would say, maybe to paraphrase, he's kind of saying, "What's wrong with you? What is wrong with you?" When he had said these things, verse 17 says, all his adversaries were ashamed. He put them to shame. And all the people rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him. So the question, of course, is in verse 15. And one thing I notice here, compassion, care for animals is just assumed here. And so we ought to, we ought not be abusive of animals, but animals are not humans in the sense they don't have a soul that lives beyond this life. That's what makes humans so unique. We're made in the image of God. That soul lives on. And so Jesus has healed this woman. The synagogue ruler is criticizing her and indirectly criticizing Jesus for healing on the Sabbath. But Jesus calls him a hypocrite. He wants folks to think he's concerned about doing God's will, this Sabbath law that he's misapplying and binding things that the Sabbath law never bound. But he wants people to think he's concerned about doing God's law and following God's law to the letter. But he doesn't care about this woman. And Jesus says, you got a problem. Something is wrong with you when you do more to care for an animal than you do to care for a human being. And you know, again, abortion's been a hot topic lately. You've no doubt seen preachers write articles, maybe things on the internet, things like that, but think about the punishment in our country if you hurt the egg of a bald eagle, endangered species. Oh, I mean, you can face prison time. But of course, you know, Roe versus Wade been overturned now, but it's still legal in some places. And in those places, you could take the life of that child and nobody says a thing. In fact, the law would say, well, that's your right. And people sometimes say things like, you know, well, my body, my choice. Well, what about the choice of the child? And so more care for an animal than for a human being. And Jesus, I mean, we would say he called them out, these religious leaders that would care more about an animal than a human being. And so if it's right to help an animal on the Sabbath, how much more so to help a human being? That's the point of what Jesus is saying here. He taught that a man is better than a sheep or an ox or a donkey or whatever animal. We ought to be concerned with helping people. The next question is right here, same context, of course. So ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan hath bound, or has bound, New King James says, think of it, for 18 years, be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath. So, again, it is perfectly, or was, under that law of Moses, perfectly acceptable to show compassion, to do good, to help someone on the Sabbath. Jesus says so. In fact, in Matthew, let me get the exact text here. Matthew 12, I think it's, not sure I got the right reference here. Yeah, Matthew 12, verse 12. This is after he has healed somebody in the synagogue, a man with a withered hand. They asked Jesus in that context, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days? That they might accuse him. He said unto them, what man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? You reckon that'd be some work to get a sheep out of a pit? I mean, to ask that question is to answer it, right? Is that okay? Do you just leave your animal? Well, it's a Sabbath day, I can't do any work. That was never God's point in giving that law. He tells them why he gave the law. So you rest. It's a day of worship. But if a situation comes up like that, where an animal falls in the pit, yeah, get it out. They understood that when it came to animals. But now they want to criticize Jesus for healing someone on the Sabbath? And that's Matthew 12:12. How much then is a man better than a sheep? Listen to what Jesus says at the end of verse 12. Wherefore, it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days. And with that, of course, in Matthew 12, Jesus tells the man, stretch forth thine hand. He stretched it forth, and it was restored whole, like as the other. And verse 14 tells us in that same text there in Matthew 12, then the Pharisees went out and held a council against him, how they might destroy him. They couldn't argue with it. They didn't say, well, you know what, guys, we've been kind of radical on this. We've been binding where God hasn't bound, and we need to change that. Oh, no. They would not entertain any thought for a moment that they could be wrong, and they accused the very Son of God of being wrong. And so that's the point here in Luke 13, 15, and 16. Yes, sir. Yeah, Jimmy's point being that a lot of these religious leaders that refuse to believe, it's almost like they want to erase any trace of evidence. that Jesus is the Messiah. And of course, that was the primary purpose of miracles, to show, to confirm he is the Christ. He is the Son of God. And so it's like they're constantly trying to erase the evidence or stop it from even, that evidence from being presented. And so they're always critiquing. And yeah, Jesus, his anger does. I think Jimmy, you're right. His anger seems to grow with this. We would say righteous indignation. He's not just angry for no cause, but he's upset because these people, they bind things God hasn't bound. They refuse to believe on the Messiah who's been prophesied and promised for hundreds of years, centuries. And here's Jesus fulfilling all the prophecies. He's showing signs that are indisputable, and they still refuse to believe. And here they are valuing an animal, helping an animal more so than a human being. And to your point, Jimmy, they're even at least one occasion, a couple of occasions, going to say, well, sure, he did this miracle, but he does it by the power of Satan. That's how desperate they get to try to discount this indisputable evidence. And of course, Jesus ties them up in knots with that as well, saying, well, if I do this by Satan, what about your children? Of course, we talked about that. Was that last? I don't know if that was last week or the week before. But yeah, that's a good point. Yes, sir.
If they were to limit the amount of distance that you could travel on the Sabbath to 8 miles, wouldn't almost everybody that's came to the synagogue have to have broken that? Because that's less than 700 feet.
Yeah. And I can't promise you that's what their tradition said, but it was some like pretty small distance. And a lot of them had, that's one of the reasons why you see, do what now?
It would be how you make everybody have to stay in the temple and have to be close by, and they have to pay for lodging, and they have to pay for meals, and they have to be all together but all expensed.
Oh, yeah. I hadn't thought about that. A good way to get in cahoots with people, and you make more money. You got to stay close to the synagogue. Can't walk far. And they did have synagogues. I mean, almost in every little town, village. They were very common, and they're just scattered all over. And of course, the ironic thing in that is some of that they're doing, no doubt, in binding their man-made rule about how far you can travel. But what they unwittingly did was they actually helped the spread of the gospel, because when the church comes into existence, and Paul and others are traveling, but especially read about this with Paul, is in every town, he knows he's got a ready-made audience, and he heads straight for the synagogue. If there's a synagogue there, he's going to go. And it's pretty rare that there's not. We read of a few instances, such as Philippi in Acts chapter 16. There's no synagogue there, or at least no record of one. It would seem not to be one, because that's always the first place he went. But here in Philippi, he comes and he finds out, well, there's some people that gathered down by the river for prayer. And so he goes there, and that's where he meets Lydia and preaches to her, and she ends up obeying the gospel. So yeah, they have so many of those man-made laws, and I don't even know how many hundreds of them there are. I've read some statistics before, and you can still read a lot of those. They're in the, I think it's the Mishnah that records a lot of those, but just ridiculous how they bind these things. And so Jesus is saying here it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath day. All right, let's go into chapter 14. I got 5 minutes, but there's a lot of good stuff there in Luke 13. Jesus, again, he's going to heal a man on the Sabbath day. This is 14, really the first 6 verses. And he asks them, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day? And he's going to make the point again. If you have an animal that falls into a pit, pull him out on the Sabbath day. They could not answer him. So Jesus is going to attend a banquet. I think it was maybe last year, year before, I think it was for our graduates, honoring our graduates. I preached from this passage. He gives he attends a banquet, and then he gives this parable about heaven's banquet, is the way that my Bible has the heading. But then he's going to talk about the cost of being a disciple. There are great multitudes with him, verse 25. He turns, says to them, if any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whosoever doth not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. He's not telling us he wants us to hate our family. He's saying God comes first. You have to have a priority. Because what if, going through the list, what if your father or your mother or your wife or your children or your brethren or your sisters encourage you not to follow God or to do something that goes against the will of God? Well, if you love them more, then what are you going to do? You're going to do that which is against the will of God. But if you love God more, you're going to choose God. Now here's our next question. For which of you intending to build a tower sitteth not down first and counteth the cost, whether he have sufficient to finish it? Lest haply after he hath laid the foundation and is not able to finish it, all that behold it began to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. And so he asked this question here in the context of counting the cost and in the context of loving God above and before all else. And so he's speaking here, the to whom this question was asked is the great multitudes of verse 25. And he's speaking about being a disciple, a follower of Jesus. And so he mentions three scenarios where you cannot be his disciple. If you love family members or your own life more than Jesus, you cannot be his disciple. That's number one in verse 26. If you don't take up your cross, bear your cross, and follow Jesus, that's the very meaning of a disciple, right? A follower. If you don't bear your cross and follow Jesus, you cannot be his disciple, verse 27. And then verse 33 is going to make the point, if you don't forsake all, you cannot be his disciple. The point of the question here is, if you are considering making the decision to become a follower of Jesus, think it through. Think it through. Make sure that you are committed no matter what. Because according to 2 Peter 2, 20 through 22, if you escape the pollution that is in the world through lust, and you are again entangled therein, what's the next statement? The latter end is worse than the beginning. Two very graphic illustrations, a dog returned to his own vomit, sow that was washed or wallowing in the mire. That's how that's pictured by God. And so he says, think it through. And going on in our text here into verse 31, another question that's same context. Or what king, going to make war against another king, sitteth not down first and consulteth, whether he be able with 10,000 to meet him that cometh against him with 20,000? Or else while the other is yet a great way off, he sendeth an embassage and desireth conditions of peace. So likewise, whosoever he be of you that forsaketh not all that he hath, he cannot be my disciple. So the context of this question in verse 31 is the same as the previous. It's the second illustration here about counting the cost. Jesus, again, uses a commonly known, a very familiar, illustration or activity to make a spiritual point. And so following Jesus means forsaking all. It's not for little kids. It's not for little kids in the literal sense of being old enough to understand and obey the gospel. But it's not for little kids in the sense of, we sometimes say marriage is not for babies. You got to have some maturity, right? And one of the things that anybody that thinks about getting married, somebody comes to me and says, hey, we want to get married. Will you marry us? Maybe, but I want to talk to you first, because I'm not going to do that if I don't see here are some people that understand. They've kind of counted the cost and thought about this, because Jesus says, no man having put his hand to the plow and looking back, Luke 9:62, is fit for the kingdom of God. So he gives this illustration. Somebody starts to build, they lay the foundation, and now, I've run out of money. I think I've told y'all before about on our trip to Peachtree City, where the kids play in their hockey league there, we always pass by these buildings. And I don't know what happened. I don't know if it was the crash of 2008 or what, but they're just these empty buildings, and the walls are up, and they had windows, but it's just empty. And been that way for, I think we first started going out there around 2015, and they finally, just within the last year or so, they actually tore them down. Now there literally is just a concrete slab foundation, and that's it. And so, you know, people drive by and they say, oh, look, somebody started to build and just wasn't able to finish. Did they run out of money? What happened? Maybe they didn't count the cost. Jesus says count the cost. So you don't want to likewise go and say, hey, I'm gonna go and I'm going to make war with this nation. And then all of a sudden here somebody comes back and says, hey, he's coming with about 1 million troops. And here you got 100,000. And you're outnumbered 10-1. What do? Well, you better send an ambassador and desire conditions of peace. And that's humiliating. So the idea here is count the cost. Sometimes people just jump in and they don't count the cost. Jesus says, you want to be my disciple? You got to forsake all that you have. Give up. Be willing to give up everything, everyone, to do what's right and follow God. That's what it's all about. Count the cost, but understand, at the end of the day, as we often sing, heaven will surely be worth it all. Thank y'all very much. Appreciate the comments and feedback, and we will put a peg there, and Lord willing, pick up with our next question in Luke chapter 15 next week. Thank y'all. We'll have a break before our worship.